We're going to sand these curved areas that we weren't able to get at with a larger block in the last episode. And we're going to use my stick. I've talked about this stick in several episodes. I've been using this stick for the Lord 20 years plus. It's a piece of old A-grade cedar siding, and it's perfect. It's got just the right amount of flexibility. It allows me to get my hands around this thing and to wrap the sandpaper in it so that I can control the stick and the sandpaper. And because of that flexibility, I can get wrapped around those shapes without, again, we talked the last time about putting facets or flat spots. We don't want to flat spot this stuff. We want to maintain as much of the curves as we can to the original stock. So same thing as the last time, 100 grit. We're trying to get the old finish off and not sand directly into the wood itself. So we're going to sand with the grain or with the orientation of the wood. You've heard that old saying, "Don't go against the grain." I believe that's a woodworker's reference. That if you start sanding cross grain, you're going to put in scratches that's contrary to the natural bias of the wood. In which case, that's going to, when you put your finish on, it's simply going to show up, and you don't want that to happen. We don't want to change the relationship of the wood or the heights of the wood to the metal or to the receiver itself. And because I saw the gun before we took it apart, I know how well the wood fit. I've got a little bit of room to play because the stock was slightly proud of the original metal. I mentioned in the last video the nice thing about stripping poly finishes is that they, as opposed to sinking down or penetrating down into the wood fibers or pores themselves, that these poly finishes pretty much just lay flat on the surface, especially when they're applied with a spray gun. I mentioned in the last video that I'd had several requests to show my finishing process, the finishes that I mix, and I'm going to give that a video all of its own. But in the case of my secret sauce, as I've termed it, that is going to be a Patreon only video. Spent some time over the years trying to figure out what kind of finishes I can use that somewhat closely replicate some of those original factory finishes, but get that out of a modern mass-produced materials. So we'll talk about that in that video. So if you're not already a patron, please consider heading on over to my Patreon page, and I will have that video coming up sometime before the end of March. Tough sometimes figuring out how to do this without doing damage. I'm just filling that inletting up with some blocks because I don't want to break it, as I was saying earlier. In an earlier video, I talked about style lines or shadow lines, and Ruger has always been pretty good at their designing their style lines into their wood stocks. So the shape of a gun stock is pretty organic. I mean, it's designed to do its job, to function, but it's also designed to be somewhat aesthetic, and it's also designed to fit the ergonomics of an individual. So consequently, we're not talking about flat boards here. We're talking about things with radiuses, and of course, the better the design, the better the design philosophy, if you will. The more artistic it becomes, the more beautiful that it can be. And frankly, some gun manufacturers are better than others at this. So consequently, there's a lot of non-flat or non-linear shapes, if you will. I don't know if that's the right word, but we need to get in and sand those areas. So I have a bunch of tools that I use. So depending on the size of the radius that I'm looking to work, I have this larger dowel, and I can get in and bridge those radiuses, and that gives me the opportunity not to square up or distort those radiuses. I've got different size pipes that I use. This is a piece of PVC pipe that I cut off, and you notice they're all about the same length. This is a piece of aluminum conduit that I use, and again, that radius is going to come in handy, for instance, up in this area, up in the front here, where the bolt itself works back and forth for the clearance for that. We have to sand down this recess that was put in for that bolt clearance. So again, I'm mostly interested in getting that front radius sanded out. Trying to keep it as flat as I can because I don't want to angle this off. Again, I'm trying to respect the original shadow lines, the original light lines of the manufacturer. I'm coming to that radius and I'm just radiusing it and pulling it up. And then same thing back here. This is a larger radius here. And remember here, I'm stripping finish, not trying to do the final sanding yet. And then I'll come in with the stick, my lovely stick, and do the same thing on the flat of this. We're transitioning from a flat to this radius. Now, one of the things that when you're in production and you're using these larger belts, what happens is the belts sort of slide over the edge of this, and you get a little bit of a radius right here. So what I'm going to do when we get to final finishing is I'm going to try and bring this radius back enough into this flat that we get a much crisper appearance to it. And again, just creating those light lines or shadow lines that are crisper and more professional looking. So we are going to take this production stock and we're going to try to up it a little bit. So there is another angle right along here. So there's two angles. There's the flat here. There's another 40-45 degree angle here, and then of course the side of the radius, and that all blends up into it. And we actually had a cutter that was specific to creating this cut, and the cutter itself had those two angles built into it. One of the problems is when we sand these things with the machine sanders or the belt sanders or the balloon sanders, it tends to wipe those out. But it is a part of that design cue for the gun itself or the stock itself. So I'm gonna try and replicate that. And when we get closer to the final finish, I'm just sort of mirroring that or following that 40-45 degree angle, stripping the finish off of it. When we get closer to the final finish, I'm probably going to go in there with a file and try to recreate those or crisp those up. Again, trying to up the level of art that's in this gun stock when I give it back to its owner. The last thing I have to finish to consider this stripped is right around this back radius in the cap itself. Now, I'm not going to pull the cap. In fact, when Ruger sanded these originally, they sanded them with the cap in place, and then they finished them with the cap in place. So the cap and the stock were finished together, and then the finish was applied over the top. And in order to get this back radius, we need to use, again, we talked about the dowels, but in this case I'm going to use just a nice rat tail or just a nice round file that happens to match that radius. And it's the same thing. I still have to sand with the grain. So I'm going to simply come up and roll it, and emphasizing that I am stripping, not sanding. We don't want to distort this cap, and once we're down into the final sanding, again, I'm going to add back a little bit of the art here and try to even this up. But just using the sandpaper, and I'm just rolling the file and the sandpaper. I suspect that's about as good as I'm going to get to start with. Let's consider this Ruger 44 Carbine International fully stripped. When we come back next time, we're going to do a survey. We're going to look at this, and we're going to find all of the dents, we're going to find the story, the history, and then we're going to look at each of those dents, each of those dings that sort of got into these things. There's a couple significant ones. We'll talk about those, and then we're going to talk about how we're going to fix them. And the most of this we're going to do by steaming out those dents. There's no reason why with some patience we can't get nearly every one of these dents out of the wood and get this so it looks, when it's done, basically like an original stock. Right? So that's our goal. That's the process we're going to work towards. So if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. Ring that bell so you get notified the next time I post a video. Give it a thumbs up, tag it, share it with your friends, and I'll see you in the next one.